How do we pronounce that name?
Was it Maki?
Or Maki?
Maki.
Ah! Nailed
All right.
it, nailed it. All right, he's winning. Eric's winning so far.
All right. Hey, man, what did you want to talk to us about today?
So today I kind of wanted to explore something I've been thinking about recently.
Okay.
And that is the idea that people, even though they think they have faith in God, they don't really have faith in God, but instead they have faith in their preachers and their parents and their whomever is telling them that God exists and things like that. And one reason I was kind of thinking about that is because a lot of times you hear Christians say things like, oh, you have faith in science, you have faith in, and I think partially they kind of have a point because, for example, I'm a programmer. I don't have a lot of time. I'm also a full-time student. I'm also a parent. I don't have time to go and explore evolution and all of these different things in science that I believe in. So I'm not believing in these things because I personally went through and explored these things, but I believe in them because I believe the scientists aren't lying to me. I believe that they have good intentions.
Maki, how do you define faith?
Well, I think the way they define faith is wrong.
Okay, how do you define faith?
What they... Oh, I don't...
Because
okay.
a lot of people... a lot of people define faith differently. And so we can talk about they, but ultimately that's going to be a subsection of people who define faith in different ways. How do you define faith?
Right.
Because you just said it can be justified. So I'd like to talk about that.
I'm saying, when I say faith, as far as my faith in scientists, I'm saying it in the colloquial, having trust in them. But I think the religious version of faith, having a belief in something unseen, unheard, and untestable, I think that part, they're tricking themselves into thinking they have faith in God, but in reality, they have trust in or the colloquial version of faith in their preachers, in their...
Let's try some different definitions. Let's try some different definitions, because if you're using one word to mean multiple things, it can be very, very confusing. An example of that is when I learned the difference between sex and gender. Right. Once that was explained to me, I was able to have a much more nuanced conversation, because then we were able to differentiate between things and talk about things directly. Right. So the best definition of faith that I've read is belief without evidence. Right. It sounds like what you have is confidence. Right. It sounds like because you understand the scientific method, we can say, okay, through the scientific method, through testing and through exploring, coming up with a hypothesis and coming through to the conclusion, learning about the world around us, based on evidence, we've been able to learn things about the world around us, right? When you have faith, you actually don't have that evidence. And so if that's the case, then would you say that you have faith in scientists?
But I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Maki, but I think what he's trying to say is more that, like, we have to have a certain amount of trust, and maybe I'll just use trust because faith is such a loaded term, but we have to have a certain amount of trust that these people who are telling us about this evidence are being truthful. Because again, we didn't go and check all the fossils and do all the carbon dating and everything. And I think you're right, absolutely, that you can't have faith in God, at least in the sense of the term that you're using, because God never said anything, right? God never comes to the church and says, like, well, okay, so this is how I feel about homosexuality or what have you. So yeah, absolutely, you have to have trust in the preacher versus having trust in the science, et cetera. Obviously the difference is that when it comes to the science, we truly do vet it, right? So you don't see, you don't see religion cohering on an answer. That's how you can kind of tell it's not true, right? So when heliocentrism was first proposed, right? There were a lot of scientists that didn't believe in it. They thought, oh, that's wacky as hell. We've got these epicycles. It all makes sense. The Earth is the center of the galaxy. And it wasn't just some naive belief. They had a lot of good evidence that they'd built up for this, right? But over time, because we were using a standard of evidence, all the scientists came into agreement, right? Eventually, it all coalesced on one answer. That doesn't happen with religion because there's nothing to test it against, right? So when you have faith in God, what you're having faith in is your pastor, your preacher, who may not be saying the same, or certainly is not saying the same thing as the preacher down the road. Right? Whereas when you have faith in science, there are obviously some fuzzy edges around in science. There are some things that we don't know for certain. There are some things where things are open to interpretation, and thus there are multiple theories. But by and large, science sort of like comes together and all comes to agreement. And that's the difference, right? We're having faith in something that we know is self-correcting. And again, using faith in the way that you're using it, Maki, we have faith in something that's self-correcting, as opposed to having faith in something that just continues to faction off and split off and have diametrically opposed, mutually exclusive conclusions that they draw. So I don't know how well that speaks to your question, but just in terms of clarification, I think if I failed to clarify that correctly, please let me know. But I think that's more the type or the way that he's using the term faith here.
Okay.
Correct. Yes. So it's not that. Yeah. Exactly. It's not that I think the. But first of all, I don't by any means think that they're right in having trust in their preachers. I just think that they do have trust in their preachers the same way. I mean, clearly, I don't think they're correct. That's why I don't believe in my preachers, or my bishop rather. But I think that the same faith that I have, or the same trust that I have in scientists, by and large, I'm not talking about like the people who make this their life. I'm talking about just the average churchgoer, the average believer. They don't have time to sit and explore all of these deep theoretical concepts about heaven the same way I don't have time to think about all the concepts in science. But in that same way, I think they don't actually have faith in God, even though they believe they do. Well, I think they actually have faith in, or they have trust in their preachers.
I don't know.
Does that make sense?
It does, but if I were to lock you in a room and tell you that if you go outside of that room, you will be killed, and that's all you've ever known, then, yeah, you believed me, but I can leave the room and you would still be terrified of walking out, right? I mean, there comes a point where you are perpetuating things, and one of the reasons I know why I do this, and we've talked about this before, is exposing people. Sometimes it's just seeing the other side. It's giving them the chance to see what critical thought looks like, that they can give it a shot. The difference is, I think, building on what you said, Noah, is, what was the Ricky Gervais quote? You can get rid of science and you can get rid of religion. And in 100 years, 200 years, 1,000 years, science will be back exactly the same or better, and religion will be completely different.
Well, of course, the problem with that is that the religious people would disagree with the precept and say, no, God would come back and he'd send another Jesus or whatever, and the whole thing would regrow. You are correct, obviously, but it's pretty easy because it's such a hypothetical. Yeah. But yeah, just another thing that was occurring to me, Maki, about your point, that the difference between having faith in a preacher and having faith in God, right, is that, again, these preachers are saying things that are diametrically opposed, right? A preacher one says something that is, the preacher one says that God loves everybody regardless of their sexual orientation, right? Preacher two is Steven Anderson out in Arizona screaming and yelling about God, how God hates gay people and everything. So you can't, again, because you have multiple different people interpreting God's word in multiple different ways, you can't really say that you have faith in God. You can only have faith in one person's interpretation of that God.
Yeah.
Correct. Yes. I think you're right about that.
All right. That's that's something to stew over. I just I don't know, having confidence does not necessarily, it is not all created equal.
Yeah, right. And, well, no, I don't think
yeah, and that's just kind of what strikes me right away with that, because Maki, you may not be saying that, but almost every time I hear something like that, it is being, trying to, they try and
you have
equivocate
faith
things.
in the same way that we do. Right.
But what's really funny underlying that is it usually comes after when you say faith is bad and they say, well, you have just as much faith in us. Isn't that just kind of a, taking, okay, if faith is bad, then you're just as bad as us. Like,
too quote.
Yeah. So anyway.
No, I think you're right. I think the main thing is, I think they are right in that we have faith the same way they do. I think they're just wrong about what their faith is. I think they think their faith is one thing, but it's actually something else.
I would get rid of that word. That is an incredibly confusing word, Maki.
Well, so I would.
I think they have faith in I think they think they have faith in God, but in reality, they have trust in their preachers.
Yeah,
They don't actually have faith in God.
Yeah,
maybe.
I think that's right, but I would push back against the idea that what we have is basically the same as what they have, right? So I don't have confidence in in science. Just in general, the same way that a religious person has confidence in their pastor, right? And I know this because as a bit of a leader in the secular movement, I know that people who turn to me for answers won't hesitate to call me out when I get something wrong.
Yep.
Right? Like the people in the atheist community will immediately stand up and say, no, you're wrong about that, and here's why. You don't see that in the religious community, right? People in the scientific community are the same way.
You should see the live chat jump on me when I say something incorrect. I mean, almost immediately.
Right.
I actually said something poorly, just my grammar was off, and I was corrected already.
We're also pedants in the atheist community.
Yes, we are, but it's
large.
appreciated. It's never something that I'd be bitter or angry about because it
helps you get better.
I take it as people wanting me to be the best version of myself that I can be, and they're coaching me, even if it's rough. But Maki, thank you for calling in. I think